Morning, everybody, and welcome to the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee. I've still got a few more people joining, but it has the participant count has slowed, so I think we will get underway. So, a very warm welcome to the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee this morning, and to our discussion on what is the role of science in delivering the government's plan to build back better. Obviously, the last 15 months have been very difficult for the nation as a whole. It's changed many of the ways that we do things. It's had a huge economic impact on our economy. However, it does present us with opportunities to build on the things that we have learnt over the last 15 months. And to help me explore that today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome a very distinguished panel of speakers who are going to explore this subject today. First, we have Professor David Patterson. David is President of the Physiological Society and Head of Department of Physiology, Anatomy and Genetics at the University of Oxford. David, good morning, welcome, thank you for joining us. We have Steve Reese, who is Vice President for Discovery Biology at Astrazeneca. Good morning, thank you very much again for your time this morning. We have Naomi Weir, who is Head of Innovation at the CBI. Naomi, good to see you again. And finally, we will hear from Paul Drabwell, who is Deputy Director, Place, Impact and Research, Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, colloquially known as BASE. So welcome, Paul. Again, thank you for joining us. Each of our panelists is going to speak for around 10 minutes. I will, when the 10 minutes is getting close, give a sort of a I will turn my mic on first, which is an indication that I'm about to try and interrupt and say perhaps we could wrap things up. But I do want to hear very much what our speakers have to say, so I won't be that rigid on time, and obviously we will let you finish. With regards, once we've heard from all four of our panelists, we'll then go to questions. Please, can I encourage you to use the Q&A function rather than chat. It's just easier to keep all the questions in one place so that they can be marshaled into a list that I can then draw from. I will then call you by name. Your microphone will be activated and you'll be able to ask your question in person. Other than that, please everyone remain on mute if they're not speaking. It just improves the sound quality. And other than that, I want to say again, thanks for joining us. I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting discussion. And to kick that off, we are going to start with Professor David Patterson. David, over to you for 10 minutes, please.
Good morning, Stephen, and thank you for the introduction. If I could just maybe share some slides as an aid memoir to myself. Is that okay? Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
Right, so again, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the opportunity to make some introductory comments about the role of science in delivering the government's agenda of build back better. I would just like to focus really on three particular words here: visibility, inclusivity, and sustainability, which pretty much underpins what the Physiological Society is doing at the moment. But on reflection, these three words, I think, are also at the heart of what the government is trying to achieve going forward in terms of build back better. So if we drill into some of the narrative from the government about what it wants to do, and in particular, 4 points here: learn lessons from the pandemic, and clearly this is about visibility. And science has never been more visible in the United Kingdom because we've had to learn about science, the general public at least anyway, in terms of how we're to cope in getting out of this current crisis. The notion of levelling up across the UK, and I think this is very important, about inclusivity, and then taking on long-term particular problems. And this is also about sustainability, and with this create high quality jobs. And this is where the knowledge economy is very important. And I think probably everyone on this call would not need too much convincing that science is going to be one of the underpinning platforms for the government to achieve its Build Back Better strategy going forward. So I like numbers, so let's have a look at some data, and particularly the life sciences sector. And this is incredibly important to the United Kingdom. It generates over £80 billion a year, employs about 250,000 people, and the life science sector is expected to grow significantly in terms of revenue in the next 5 years, but also add jobs. But if you look at on the right-hand side, this histogram, you can see, looking at the distribution of employment, and this is for biopharma and med tech, you can see it's pretty lumpy. That is, most activity takes place in the southeast, south central, and London area, and it tails all the way off when you get to Northern Ireland. And the cartoon just on the left-hand side hotspots the location. So if one wants to level up, if we could use that language, then clearly there's going to be a challenge here for government to do that. And with that will come need for spend in terms of infrastructure. But with a so-called level up, if one wants to go down this road, one's also got to be very mindful with the tension between not breaking up critical mass units, because there is a danger that you can get into dilution going forward, and this may come out in the discussion. This is probably one of the most important pictures I'm going to show, because in many ways it's a bit of a reality check in terms of wanting to have high aspiration for science. And of course, the high aspiration is predicated on a sustainable funding budget going forward if one wants to be a superpower in science, which is the rhetoric coming out at the moment. And this is a terrific ambition to be a superpower in science, but one also has to be realistic about where we are and in terms of what we're doing. Now, it has to be said that the United Kingdom certainly punches above its weight in terms of science production, given the money that comes in. So this is the UK here. And if you scale us in relation to our other OECD partners, you can kind of see we're in the middle of the pack. In fact, we're well below the OECD average for spend. Now, it was very welcomed when the government sent signals to the community that it wanted to increase its spend in science up to 2.4% of GDP, which is absolutely terrific to get there by 2027. But having said that, that only makes you average. And of course, if you look to the right of the OECD average, you see Belgium, Germany, United States, Finland, Denmark, China, Sweden, Japan, South Korea, and Israel. You know, these are the superpower science funders in the system. And I think to hit the level of so-called superpower in science, one's really going to have to look to that rightward trend here. But having said that, moving from where we are to the right is, of course, to be welcomed. One of the real challenges, and this has exposed science in the United Kingdom, is certainly the pandemic, because it has certainly shown where the stress points are in the system. And if you take an area that I'm a little bit more familiar with, that is medical research-based funding, what we know in the United Kingdom is that about half of the research-based funding in this sector is non-government funding. That is, it comes from charities. And the charitable sector has taken a massive hit in the pandemic, with some of the agencies having their funding dropped by 40 to 50%. And that's going to be a real challenge. And this is superimposed on really what we say is a broken QR funding model. This is the dual support system that underpins charitable funding going into universities. And forget COVID for the moment, but even pre-pandemic, this dual support funding system is under immense pressure, and it is going south. And I would make the comment that if we want equivalence with our American universities, then I could almost say that no major American competitor would want to be primarily accepting charitable funding based on the UK funding model, because as many people will know, it costs money to run money. And at the moment, this is under real pressure going forward. There are two big challenges in the system in the UK, and this first one, we could have a whole session on that, and I don't propose to comment on this extensively, but just to say, as physiologists in particular, we are animals and we are a part of this ecosystem and contribute to it and influence its change. And this is critically important going forward, and there will have to be some big changes take place. But of more immediacy is this one down here, the aging society. And I think it's quite clear that lifespan has really outpaced health span in the United Kingdom and indeed the advanced Western world. That is, people are living longer, but they're living longer in ill health. And what I would say from my perspective is that it's not necessarily your chronological age is the issue here. It's really your physiological age. So what I mean by that is that you could have a very healthy 60-year-old who's in much better shape than a 30-year-old. And I think we've seen some of the disparities come out with this particular situation in COVID. That is, we know that inequality between rich and poor has had an impact on people's response to this particular pandemic. And we know that the positive correlate for not doing well with COVID is, of course, age. And when you get older, your frailty score increases. So frailty correlates well with age. But a frailty score, that is a physiological frailty score, is just not the domain of the elderly. It is also seen in the middle-aged population as well, especially those with underlying comorbidities, which have not fared well in this particular pandemic. So in terms of leveling up, this is going to be a big challenge going forward for the government in the future. If I could just finish coming back to these 3 points here: visibility, inclusivity, and sustainability. It's quite clear that there have been some terrific lessons learned from this particular pandemic, and we are still learning those lessons, and history will write them out over time. I think it's fair to say that whilst we had a shaky start into this pandemic, science has really helped the position of the United Kingdom and also the position of the world here. And science has really underpinned that position. And if we look at how to make a vaccine in record time, which I think is really the UK's big contribution here, with a fantastic rollout capability given the national health system, it's really been an exemplar performance in the country itself. But what I would say is that it's not if we're going to have another crisis coming forward, it's when we will have that crisis. And in order for the United Kingdom to have responded so well with its vaccine strategy and its rollout, this has been built on decades of investment. And I just don't necessarily mean infrastructure here. I mean intellectual greyware in the system. Science is not a situation that you can turn on and off like a tap. If you turn the tap off, it takes a long time to turn it back on again. So the vaccine success out of Oxford has really been built on decades of intellectual growth within the system for the institution to be able to repurpose itself to come back and give a vaccine in partnership with Astrazeneca to the UK and the world. So if there are any politicians on this particular call, and I think there are some, my very simple take-home message would be start early. That is, it takes at least 10 years to start to turn a big super tanker called science in the system. So, Stephen, let me just stop here and then pass back to you.
David, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating. And yes, your final message is heard loud and clear. And there are a few of us across Parliament who champion science in general and are regularly lobbying ministers to make sure that they are, meeting their commitments. I would say indeed, I recently sat on a bill committee for the establishment of ARIA, the Advanced Research and Inventions Agency, and I think that will be an interesting addition to the overall research landscape. I mean, it's a relatively small agency, but it's that high risk, high reward science that it will have the ability to fund. But I was interested in one question to you, which was around, there is no doubt there is a massive focus on the role of science in society that there hasn't necessarily been before. We have built some science capital out in the general public. How do we harness that and use that focus to help inform people of the role of science and the opportunities it presents for them and society? Do we need 2022 to be the year of STEM or something along those lines? I'd be interested in your ideas of how we use that for the greater good.
Well, with all crises, there's an opportunity, and I think science has one. On the back of a world pandemic, and my instinct on this would be, we need to build that science base very strongly, early on, at the school level, from primary school to secondary school. I'm coming from, a very well established old university. And, whilst we need that too, I would say it's the pipeline of the next generation that needs to come into the system that we should be concerned about. You remember that pipeline must be kept fluid, and you must keep redoing it all the time. If I could use the analogy, the pipeline is the infrastructure of the system. It's what you push through that pipeline. You can put as much money as you like into it, but if you don't have the people coming through, then you end up creating white elephants in systems. So I would say start early. You've already got the population very enthusiastic about science. Most people we've never heard of a T cell before, or a B cell, or immunity and infection. So the general public is well attuned to science at the moment, especially the life sciences. And I think we should be really making hay of that particular point. Never had we have had so many people interested in wanting to read medicine, certainly at my university. And I'm sure that's true throughout the United Kingdom. And never have had so many people interested in the biomedical sciences. And I think that's terrific for the UK, given the science legacy that this country has developed. And I think going forward, if we could just keep the momentum up with sensible funding and get on the right side of that OECD funding line, because actually, if you look at the superpower-based countries in science, they are the ones that have done best during the pandemic, as long as their government ministers have listened to the scientific advice. Now, not all of those countries have, but most of them have. And you can see how well they have done.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Much appreciated for your thoughts. Right, we will move on now to Steve Reese. And as I said, Steve is Vice President for Discovery Biology at Astrazeneca, a name that's probably on the lips of most people, certainly in the UK, if not around the world these days. Steve, we very much look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. And just to check, can everyone hear me okay?
We can.
We can. Good. Right, I will just share my desktop as well and pull up the slides. Here we go. So yes, if anyone hadn't heard of Astrazeneca, a year or so ago. They certainly have now. We are very much a household name for obvious reasons. And it's been a real privilege actually to work for Astrazeneca over the last 12 months as we have worked with our partners at Oxford to bring the vaccine to patients as quickly as we have. And I've got 6 or 7 slides here really just to talk about our view in terms of how the UK can continue to take a leading position in terms of medicines discovery as we move through the decades to come. But really, I just wanted to start by saying now really is a fantastically exciting time to be working in science. And it's a fantastically exciting time to be working in medicines discovery. And there are a number of reasons for that, but maybe 2 key reasons are the technologies that exist today to allow us to understand disease and allow us to understand the differences in disease in different patients are transformative compared to just 2 or 3 years ago. And that now creates the ability such that we can make better medicines and also specifically target those medicines to patients where they're likely to work or likely to work best using these so-called approaches of personalized medicine and diagnostics. And the other area is we live in an age where we're moving away from the sort of pills and that we're all used to going down to Boots and buying, small molecules in pills that help to treat disease, towards a huge range of different medicine types. And in 5 to 10 years' time, we're going to be treating disease with everything from antibodies, as we're doing today, to oligonucleotides, all the way through to cell and gene therapies. And these are areas where the UK can take a leading position. The UK already has a leading position in terms of clinical studies for cell therapies. Going forward, building on that position for not just simply conducting clinical studies, but the ability to create the manufacturing infrastructure for cell and gene therapy medicines is a clear opportunity for the United Kingdom. Another area is diagnostics. The science of diagnostics has been transformed over the last 12 months or so. The ability to create diagnostics that detect disease before the patient knows they have symptoms is probably the most transformative activity that could be performed in the healthcare system. And again, we in the UK have an opportunity to take a leadership position in this. So looking at Astrazeneca specifically, AstraZeneca, we have 3 major R&D sites. We are opening our new R&D centre in Cambridge, which is the little round building in the middle of this picture, later on this year. That represents a $1 billion investment in R&D in the UK. Our focus in terms of building our R&D capability is to locate our research and development in major bioscience clusters, where we can work alongside world-leading universities and world-leading biotech organisations, such that we can work with the best scientists in collaboration, and also that we can attract the best talent. And whilst we are absolutely keen to see the level of scientific delivery increase everywhere, to pick up on the point that was raised earlier, whatever is done in the UK in terms of levelling up must do nothing to risk levelling down those centres where we are global leaders. And certainly the Cambridge cluster today is the leading bioscience cluster in Europe. It is maybe the 3rd in the world compared to the Boston area and the South San Francisco area in the US. And key to that, of course, is attracting and retaining global talent. And the immigration policies that are put in place as we move through the next number of years have to be such that from a science perspective, we can both attract the best talent in the world and then retain that talent within the United Kingdom. Medicines discovery is a team game. Everything we do at AstraZeneca is in collaboration and partnership, and that is increasingly so across the field. This varies from joint research centres with academia, to partnerships with biotech companies to either access technology on new medicines, to partners with other industrial organisations to bring medicines together. And in the UK, just to touch on a couple of recent examples, we have established a so-called functional genomics centre in Cambridge with Cancer Research UK to identify new ways of treating cancer. And as far as the pandemic is concerned, we came together with GSK and the University of Cambridge to build a test centre for COVID-19 infection alongside the Lighthouse Lab programme. And just touching on the Lighthouse Lab programme, there's been a lot of positivity, a lot of criticism of the Lighthouse Lab programme. One of the primary drivers behind the ability to build that so quickly was the availability of people in industry who had experience in high throughput drug discovery, high throughput testing. Without that expertise, we would have struggled to do that. So again, retaining and building that expertise in industry in terms of not just medicines discovery, but the technologies and capabilities that enable experiments to be run at scale is critical as we move forward. So AstraZeneca, we invest 1.3 billion in R&D annually in the UK. That accounts for 19% of total UK pharma investment, and 3.4% of total investment in the UK. We welcome the government's commitment to increase R&D spend to 2.4% of GDP by 2027 and to double the public component of this. We are also very supportive of the UK developing the coordinated large-scale strategic investment platforms such as HARP and ARIA that we've mentioned earlier. A point that we're especially interested in the UK. UK today is a global leader in the development and use of genomics and precision medicine. So this is DNA sequencing of patients through the likes of the UK Biobank and also the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute. And that is an area where we would like to see continued investment to ensure that the UK retains its leading position, such that we can, as I say, better understand disease and develop personalized medicines. We're also, there is also a major opportunity for the UK in terms of medicines manufacture, and we support activities such as the Medicines Manufacturing Industry Partnership that will continue to help us build world-leading manufacturing capability. And again, we've seen that through the course of the pandemic, not just simply in terms of the relative absence of vaccine manufacturing capability in the UK a year ago that has been addressed, but building this key infrastructure for the development of vaccines, for antibodies, for next generation therapeutics represents a major opportunity for the United Kingdom. And alongside that, also building the manufacturing capabilities to develop many of the raw materials that are used to create these medicines. Today, globally, there is a shortage of a lot of the plasticware that we use in medicines discovery. That shortage is exacerbated by the demands of testing and vaccines manufacture across the world. The bulk of that manufacturing is currently happening in China. Building that manufacturing capability in the UK will help to give resilience to UK R&D base as we move forward. So in terms of building back better, first and foremost, we aspire to encourage the government to continue to invest in fundamental research in the UK, which means funding agencies such as UKRI have secure long-term funding settlements that help us achieve this target of 2.6% of GDP spend on life sciences research as we move forward. We will only locate our research activities, industrial research activities, where there is world-leading scientific excellence. We have that in the UK today. We need to continue to build that. Second, we need to bring industry and public funders of research closer together. We need to create more opportunities to collaborate and shape research through activities such as ARIA. And the driver really here is such that basic research is informed by the scientific challenges that we face in healthcare, that we face in industry, such that we're bringing relative solutions, such that we're bringing appropriate solutions to bear. The third is around skills, and just touching again on the question that you raised earlier on, Stephen. We need an approach to research skills in the UK that both encourages individuals to move into science, that allows individuals who are taking career breaks to return to science, and also that fosters a multidisciplinary approach. We believe we need to move away from traditional training in chemistry, biology, physics to multidisciplinary training, whereby individuals are equipped with not just basic science skills or advanced science skills, but also digital skills as an example, as we increasingly see the digitalization of drug discovery. And finally, we need an investment environment that supports innovative businesses. So tax incentives for R&D are important for us if the UK is to remain globally competitive. A key gap for the UK, we believe, is a venture capital ecosystem that matches places like Boston and South San Francisco in terms of the ability to translate innovation coming out of universities into the next generation of major life science companies with billion-pound market capitalization values. There are notable examples of this in the UK. We've seen companies such as Immunocore and very recently Accenture grow relatively quickly, but they're exceptions rather than the rule. For the UK to become truly leading in this space, we need to create the environment such as exists in Boston with major venture capital companies such as Arch and the like, that are willing to seed these companies, that are willing to invest significantly in these companies to grow the next generation of innovation and of course to grow the next generation of employment. And finally, just to touch on manufacturing, I've mentioned this earlier on, we would encourage the government to attract the next wave of innovative medicines manufacturing investment into the UK, such that we can become world leaders in the manufacture of these medicines, which will create further high-skilled jobs, and also, as I say, the supply chains associated with them, such that we have independence in terms of supply chain within the UK. And looking at the time, I will stop there, and yeah, happy to take any immediate questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve. That was fascinating, and I'm sure we'll generate some questions. I have a quick question, which is around, there's been a lot of talk about personalised and targeted medicines, which is fantastic, but we know that health inflation runs at a much higher level than general inflation. And so it's, how do we balance the cost of what we can do against our ability to pay for it? And is that holding back deployment and research and development of targeted and specialised and personalised medicines?
Answer your second question is no, it's not holding back the development of targeted and personalised medicines. Every program we have in Astrazeneca has a personalised medicine approach to it, such that ultimately we only give the patient medicine to a patient where we have evidence that it will work. That we believe is ethically the correct thing to do. That does raise challenges in terms of reimbursement as the market size for those medicines potentially gets smaller. That is a challenge that we will have to address as we move forward, because personalised medicine is without doubt the future of our industry.
And have you got good connections into government to have those discussions about how we are going to move to personalised medicines, which are ultimately going to be more expensive?
Actually, I would challenge whether the medicines are actually ultimately more expensive, because by definition, we will only be giving the medicines to patients who work. So we will no longer be paying huge amounts of money to give medicines to patients where they don't work, as has been the case through much of the last 20 or 30 years. To answer your question, yes, we do have good connections into government in terms of the personalised medicine strategy. I think where we have a big gap or an opportunity as the UK is taking a leadership position in terms of diagnostics. Wouldn't it be wonderful if each and every one of us on an annual basis had a single dipstick test that told us if we had one of the 5 most common cancers before we knew we had symptoms? And then we can take that medicine to cure that disease and keep us out of hospital. And that's where we'll see economic value.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Sorry, I managed to mute myself there. We'll now move on to our next speaker, Naomi Weir, Head of Innovation at the CBI. Naomi, good to see you again. It's been a while. 10 minutes, please.
Thanks, Stephen. Lovely to see you, and thank you for inviting me to join you this morning. So I think the question this panel's been set is really the role of science in delivering government's aspirations as outlined in the plan for growth. And in one sense, this can be a very short contribution, is completely critical. And it's a vital ingredient for future UK competitiveness, but that's not new, and I'm confident has been said at a parliamentary and scientific committee event before, perhaps even by me. So the last thing we need after the year we've all had is a bit more of the same. So I was attempting to draw together maybe what might be new and what has changed. And I think firstly, as we know and as we've heard, but it's the context and the size of the opportunity and challenge that faces us is very new. This is a really defining moment. We've got a once in a generation opportunity to reset our economy. And it isn't just COVID, as we've heard from others, but if a global pandemic weren't enough, the scale of the shocks facing the nation include a new relationship with the EU, the pandemic, accelerating pace of technological change, climate imperative. So it really does demand a real moment of unity and foresight. And I think they also represent a real opportunity for action starting now for the long term. So the government's plan for growth, along with accompanying strategies and plans, including the innovation strategy, is the government response, and something CBI has welcomed and does welcome. And we very much see them as necessary but not sufficient to deliver the scale and the characteristics of growth if we're to really build back better. And I think detail and action are now needed, and there's a really big role for science across the board. So science by its nature takes a long-term view. It turns unknowns into knowns and impossibles into possibles, the economically or perhaps environmentally costly and time consuming into widely available and rapid. There's so much science has to offer as we look to build back better. And I suppose for our part at CBI, we're developing an economic vision for the UK to be the most competitive, dynamic and future focused economy in the world. It really does go alongside what the government has already set out, but really taking a business view of that and thinking about actually what is the role for business in helping to deliver that. This isn't something government can deliver alone. And I think that's something for the science base as well. You know, we are going to be critical in delivering on this and thinking about what is our role and how can we do that. So it's a good question to be asking. I think innovation will be central to CBI's economic vision as well as the plan for growth. So, you know, whether that's the aims around developing thriving economic clusters to decarbonisation or leading the world in new technologies, or even transformed skills provision for the economy of tomorrow. You know, there's a role for innovation across the board, and we'll be saying more on this as the CBI when that vision's launched next week, and I'm sure we'll be back in discussion with many of you as that progresses, because it really is the start button rather than the unveiling. So I look forward to working with others on that. But I suppose the second point, as well as the sort of context and size of opportunity, is that science can be something we agree on. Now, generally as scientists, I know we like to disagree on everything because there's always finer points to get to, but I'm going to take a very broad brushstroke, if you'll permit me, and say science can be something we agree on. And we've already heard, but in the crisis, we've seen how science and innovation, you know, we've seen it in action with political and public appreciation riding high. You know, the tangible benefits have been centre stage like never before, and I think Stephen perhaps pointed to this, but you know, previous chief scientific advisors or university business collaborations would not be household names or pub quiz answers. So, you know, I don't think anyone either could have imagined we'd be doing this over Zoom from our relative rooms and houses, and you know, how far-reaching, rapid and transformational tech adoption has been to our work and personal lives. All of that's built on decades of what's gone before in terms of research and science. So all of that together, we've got a basis where science can be really something we agree on. Even pre-crisis, political parties across the spectrum agreed on the direction of travel, disagreeing on the scale of ambition for growing science strength. But in reality, you know, as David, I think, pointed out earlier graphically, we're a long way off debating the finer points of 2.4%, 3%, or whether it should be a percentage at all. And actually, you know, as you've heard, the government's landed on superpower status and reiterated funding commitments that could help the UK accelerate in that direction. But it's really in all our interests to set the wheels in motion to getting there. And the upcoming innovation strategy and the spending review really must deliver on that, as we've heard some of already. Long-term strategy, long-term funding, build on what we've got, don't rip it up and start again every time. That's something for this government, but actually given the scale of the challenges and the timelines involved in science, as we've already heard, as well as the sort of challenges, be they global challenges or national economic ones, across party lines, what can we be doing to make it easier to take long-term decisions now on something we fundamentally all agree on? And I think, you know, there is a real role for small p politics in making this work, and I'd really I think that's a big question and a challenge for science and those who support science across the board to really think about how can we make that happen and make it happen now. If you roll on 3 years or 5 years to press the start button on the version that we want, then actually we've really missed an opportunity to come together for the UK. So the role of science is perhaps something we can all agree on, and I think that's important, particularly now. And thirdly and lastly, the role for science, I wonder whether there's a bit of a role, perhaps challenge for science to build back better itself. We often talk about government join up or sector join up, but we also really enjoy our silos, if I know anything about the science community, and there are plenty of them. So as a case in point, when thinking about my contribution today, I was going to tiptoe around the words that are or aren't included in the title of today's session: science, research, translation, knowledge exchange, engineering, innovation, technology. If you add sectors and geographies into the mix, we could go on and on and on. And each of those terms has lifetimes of essential expertise attached to them, but a big role of, or perhaps challenge for science in delivering the plan for growth is to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And I think, you know, we've had this alluded to by others, but what value is vaccine discovery without manufacture and delivery at scale? Or, as David raised earlier, rapid vaccine development would be impossible without decades of underpinning investment in research. So, you know, you'd multiply that across sectors and challenges, you know, take decarbonisation, rolling out of digital infrastructure, or harnessing data and potential of AI. The technology can exist, but without regulatory frameworks or infrastructure, alongside perhaps understanding and putting to use behavioural, cultural and economic factors, we're not going to see this transformational change that we really need and that there's the really potential for. So the point is simply it's an ecosystem that we're part of. Flat budgets in recent memory haven't helped creating a sort of either-or approach to funding, with increases in one part of the system coming from cuts to another. That does need to be addressed. But in the crisis, we've seen perhaps more than ever that innovation's a team game, you know, with governments, business, universities, individual experts, innovation centres, regulators, patient groups, manufacturers within and beyond the UK's boundaries all playing their part. And so, you know, amid the unprecedented challenges presented by COVID, you know, we've heard from CBI members, you know, highlighting unexpected positive outcomes that have arisen. For instance, how COVID has helped catalyse R&D development in ways they wouldn't have been able to foresee, and transformed the way they've worked with some of their partners, including academic institutions. Or they've highlighted examples of how truncated processes and speedier decision-making have enabled real feats of fast-paced research and innovation in support of the COVID response. There's a lot of lessons to learn, and Build Back Better, the plan for growth does build that in, but I think there's a real role for science in taking that seriously. Because you've also seen some of the points of friction that could be eased, or perhaps rate determining steps that could be worked on. Some of those require policy, regulatory and funding changes, and I think engaging with the innovation strategy and other plans coming out from government is certainly a way to do that. Others might be cultural, relational, institutional, historical, habitual, or just preference. And arguably the latter are somewhat stickier and harder to change. So science thinking about how it can build back better itself could look like lots of different things. At CBI, our Innovation Council has prioritised work around supporting collaboration to innovate this year. So across all different types of organisations, but initially a particular focus on large and small organisations and companies. How can we learn from what works well and reduce barriers to productive collaboration to actually see the genuine change and output that we want and we need and we think is beneficial for the future. David and Steve both rightly raised inclusivity and skills as part of their presentations, and there's a real role for government there, but there is a big role for science here too. You know, at CBI, for example, working with our BAME Tech group to build a network, share best practice and inform action within businesses and within CBI, both within the sphere of tech and technology development, but also in the policies and various things that affect who goes into that and who can benefit from those roles in the future. So I guess the question and perhaps challenge to leave you with is what could that look like for you? And I know many businesses and many organisations are having, I guess, a moment of defibrillation, a stop to start again. And I suppose what could that look like as we need to think about our own actions and our own agency, as well as what the role is for government in building back better.
Naomi, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that. I was interested in your comment about science needs to build back better and to break down some of those silos. Is there a role for government in that, or is it really just down to the wider community itself to sort of take a closer look at the way it works and to reorganise?
It's definitely both, as you know in posing the question, but no, it definitely is both. And I think there is a real role for government in this, and a kind of a long-standing ask from CBI is around an end-to-end research and innovation system with long-term funding that goes alongside it. And I think ensuring that the strategy and support for research and innovation really does mean that things don't fall through the cracks, because we've got, you know, good support here and then something patchy and then underfunded, and as we've heard from others, turning on and off taps at points. I think that there is a real need for long-term strategic support across the breadth of the ecosystem is required, and with different business cases, I suppose, at each point for when and where and how government steps in. But I do think that that's really essential and is impossible within flat budgets, because it will always be a sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul. We probably need a new more diverse way of describing that. But I think that's always going to be the case. So at the moment we have commitments for an increase in funding. We really need to see that now, because otherwise, you know, in science terms, 2027 is very near. So we really need to see that long-term strategy that is end-to-end, that doesn't diminish our research strength, but actually enables us to capitalize on that, to really see the benefits from that.
Brilliant, thank you. Can I just remind everyone before we go to our final speaker, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, which we will come to presently. But before we do that, it's my pleasure now to ask Paul Drabwell to talk to us. As I said earlier, Paul is Deputy Director, Place, Impact and Research at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Paul, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to talk. Yes, I'm a deputy director in BEIS in the Science Research and Innovation Directorate, and my team covers broad research policy. Now, today's session is entitled "What is the role of science in delivering the government's plan to build back better?" And of course, the government's recent plan for growth announced a few things, but it announced that we would be publishing an innovation strategy. So it is a key, R&D is a key part of the plan for growth. And also reiterated, as we had done in an R&D roadmap that we published last year, that we would have an R&D places strategy as well. And just this month, the government announced it will be publishing a levelling up white paper later in the year. So there's a lot going on in this space, and R&D is at the centre of it. For today, I thought there's two particular areas I wanted to talk about. I thought I'd talk a bit about policies that relate to the development of ecosystems, and in this I include policies around universities and knowledge exchange and the commercialization of research. And then I thought I'd specifically touch on a question around place and R&D and levelling up, as we refer to it. So starting with ecosystems and the commercialization of research and university knowledge exchange. Now, I think for some time there has been a narrative around the UK which broadly says, you know, the UK is good at research, but we're not good at commercializing it. Or at least not so good at capturing the economic benefits for the UK, I would say perhaps would be more accurate. So I would argue that statement, we are good at research but not good at commercializing it, I would argue that the reality is now much more nuanced than that, actually. UK universities have become increasingly, over the last sort of few years, a lot of efforts have been made, a lot of investment in this, and UK universities have become increasingly good, actually, at commercializing their research. And if you look at sort of particular performance areas such as selling IP or developing spin-outs, then UK universities are actually performing, if you look at the data, they're performing on a par with the US, broadly speaking. So and that isn't appreciated. But there's definitely some inhibiting factor with regards to the broader ecosystem, and this would appear to relate to the absorptive capacity of businesses in the UK and the presence and diversity of investors that are playing in this space, and that includes patient investment and investment to scale up. So when it comes to commercializing research, as I've said, the data suggests broadly speaking, we're pretty much on a par with the US now. But that strong performance is concentrated in a small number of universities, sort of 5 or 6 universities, and those are the universities in the UK which are the most research intensive, and which have invested resources in putting together teams of people that can develop investable propositions, and who have developed networks with investors. So the challenge really is to spread that good practice in universities who maybe don't have the same level of research and deal flow as those universities. And we've seen that through the government has done things through Research England in particular. Government has developed programs which encourage universities to come together and aggregate their resources around IP and tech transfer. As well as there being, of course, an ongoing broader agenda around university and business collaboration through what we call knowledge exchange. Some of the specific things and policies in this area that have been developed in the last few years, I would refer to the Connecting Capability Fund, for example, which a fund which encourages universities to collaborate together, aggregate their projects and their deal flow, and aggregate their commercial expertise. And this has led to a number of things, including the establishment of funds such as the Northern Gritstone Investment Fund, which was recently announced and is led by the universities of Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield. And of course, we also have increasing investment in what we call HIFE, the Higher Education Innovation Fund, and that rewards universities for collaboration with businesses and others. And of course, we have the Knowledge Exchange Framework, the KEF, which seeks to shine a light on universities' performance in this area. So there's been a lot of, in recent times, initiatives that are driving universities in the UK, research universities, to collaborate more and more with businesses. So in thinking about, I would say that knowledge exchange agenda is definitely set to continue, and you'd expect that to be a theme in our innovation strategies going forward, and indeed questions around ecosystems and levelling up. Turning specifically to the question of places and levelling up. So this agenda, of course, goes much wider than R&D, and I think when we think about R&D and levelling up, we very much need to think about the role that R&D plays alongside other policy levers, including skills and infrastructure. And I think with regards to how R&D can help address regional growth disparities, I would say we seriously began to look at this a couple of years ago at the time of the last industrial strategy around 2017. And it's fair to say that our focus has been building, when it comes to R&D and place, our focus has been very much on building on existing or emerging strengths in local areas, and thinking about how we develop local ecosystems. There was a comment earlier around, ensuring we don't break what we have, and I think this is an important point when it comes to R&D and levelling up. I would say we need to be focusing on the outcomes that R&D can achieve, not simply how the distribution of R&D funding looks across the UK. Now, whilst that is important, and it may be that is something that might change over time, there's been a lot of debate around the fact that around 50% of all public R&D funding goes towards the Golden Triangle, and that we should simply be spreading the jam more across the UK. I would say we need to really focus on what we're doing as much as just simply spreading the jam, and we really do need to highlight on where there are existing strengths in places and build on those R&D strengths. So following that model, we developed a couple of years ago something called the Strength in Places Fund with UKRI. Some of you will be aware of this. This is a competitive fund which is focused on specific local R&D projects which help build on local R&D strengths and enhance collaboration between local institutions for the good of local economic growth. And I think it's fair to say that's the first time really that national R&D funding had a sort of places or levelling up element to it. And we'll be looking at how we can build on those sorts of things as we develop the places strategy and levelling up white paper. And I tend to think of this in three particular ways. With regards to R&D and levelling up, I would say there's something around those sorts of programs. So what should we be doing with regards to specific place-based R&D programs in the future? How might we build on and develop on funds like Strength in Places? And are there more programmatic things we can do alongside other interventions as well? And focusing on particular areas that have strength already. So, for example, can we look at a place look at what particular funds may help that local area with regards to R&D, but also working alongside others to look at how we can attract more private investment into those areas as well, and how we can showcase what that area is good at with regards to R&D. So specific place-based R&D programs. Secondly, local engagement and representation. Is there more that our national R&D funding bodies can do to engage with places across the UK? Should they have more of a regional presence? So just having more of a regional input into national R&D policy. And linked to that, thirdly, making the broader R&D system more place aware. Are there some things with regards to our existing funding and our existing infrastructure, such as our catapults, for example, and other government labs, where we should be thinking more about the local impacts and how the system more broadly can think about place. So I'm going to stop there, but just to give you, that gives you hopefully a bit of a flavour on some of the things we're working on and with regards to the strategies that we're developing. And of course, I'll be very interested to hear the conversation today. So thank you.
Paul, thank you very much indeed for that. Yes, it's always, in my view, a challenge between getting the biggest bang for your buck by putting the money into areas where you will get a return quickly, and balancing that against making sure that we are spreading the opportunity that comes from research in universities around the country. And that is something that I think will continue to be an ongoing question. But to make sure that that when we have found the answer to that question, there are enough people to deliver on it around the country, we need to make sure that our skills pipeline is full. And we'll go back to an earlier comment that David made about, we need to get people at a young age in school, push them up, help them find the pipeline, and then make sure that pipeline doesn't leak along the way, so that they actually come out of university and want to work in the field in which they've studied. What's the department's thinking, presumably with the education department, on how we can use this current focus? And this is back to the first question I asked, use the current focus on science to stimulate and enthuse young people into finding out what science can do.
Well, I mean, there is a lot going on in this area and a lot going on in the department at the moment. There's a strategy being developed I didn't even mention called the R&D People and Culture Strategy, which is particularly focusing on those very questions around the pipeline of researchers into the future. We have some existing very good measures. For example, something called STEM ambassadors, where we have volunteers going into schools, telling kids about science and I think there's more to be done definitely in those areas. I think there's more to be done in terms of us telling a story about what science achieves as well. So even in government terms, we often announce things and it's often about money, the amount of money we're investing in this and money we're investing in that. We always seem to have a challenge in telling the story about what comes out the other end, what's achieved with that. And part of that, the problem is because it takes a long time. You make an investment here and you see the rewards, as someone was saying, often in much longer time. But I think we need to get better at that as well. But people and culture, I think there's a lot of stuff there as well. I think one of the questions with regards to building back better as well, I think around research and researchers' pipeline, I think it's also breaking down the barriers between academia and business as well. So, how can we make that more porous or more mobile, so people move between academia and industry much more free and easily? And that doesn't happen that much at the moment. I think that's a challenge for us too. But I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thank you. No, I think that's absolutely the right approach. Right, thank you. We're now going to move to questions. And the first question I have is from our Vice President, Stephen Benn. Stephen.
Well, good morning, and thank to all of these speakers for a tremendously interesting range of presentations, and it would be impossible to put questions to you all. There was one thing I wanted to put perhaps to Steve first and others afterwards. In your experience over the last year, have you found a growing tension between the supply chains that you've been used to and geopolitical tensions? Because you did mention that you've encountered plastic shortages for medicinal use, and a lot of it comes from China. And that brings me on to the second half, which is, do you foresee growing tensions in the future between the use of plastics and the climate change agenda, which we're all very much thinking about this year?
Two very, very good questions. So I'll take the second one first. So prior to the start of the pandemic, we have an active program to reduce the amount of plasticware that we use in drug discovery. And that will continue to meet our carbon targets. So as AstraZeneca as an organization, we have the ambition to be carbon neutral across our entire supply chain by 2030. And that, of course, will only be achieved by moving towards renewables or replacements for much of what we do. That ambition has not been helped through the pandemic, as we are using more disposable plasticware, I think, now than we ever did before. The supply chain, I think, is a separate issue. I think the advent of the pandemic and the huge demand for basic laboratory reagents to support PCR testing first, and now to support vaccines manufacture, has exposed limited capacity for the supply of those materials globally, and has revealed our dependence upon those materials largely from China. Now, one would imagine that post-pandemic, that is the situation that would address itself as everything settles down into a new normal. But to create further resilience, I think there is certainly an opportunity to build those supply chains here. We don't believe there's a geopolitical aspect to that. It's just a simple issue of supply and demand. And right now, demand way outstrips supply.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yep.
Anyone else want to comment on Stephen's questions? No? Okay, that's absolutely fine. Thank you, Stephen. Our next questioner is Paul Cornwell. Paul. I think someone...
Hello, that was a bit of a shock.
Welcome, Paul.
Yeah. My question was about, do we at some point need to make a decision at a national level about which parts of the country should focus on what? Because it seems to me that a lot of people will be fighting over the big stuff, and there'll be a lot of, like pharma and artificial intelligence, but there's lots of industries that need lots of support from universities. And should we be thinking about, creating a map of the country where maybe the Northeast is the place to go to if you aspire to invent things to do with green chemistry or environment, and the Northwest is where you go to if you love chemistry, and if you're an engineer, you go to the Midlands. If you're a computing person, you go to the Southwest. Do we need to get to that point? Otherwise, are we not all just fighting over the same stuff?
Good question. Who would like to attempt to answer that? Dave, thank you. And then Paul.
Yes, this is a really good question, and we've been tensioning this for decades in the system, and it's the sort of redistribution model. But I think one has got to decide there are two types of science. There's discovery science, and then there's mission science. And discovery science clearly is very bottom up, and it sits predominantly within the university sector. If you're doing mission science is very directive. It's got scalability, and one could make the argument that that's where you really need the full force of public funding, that is government behind the mission to get there. And clearly for something like a national crisis or a war effort, then that's where you get more mission-driven science in the system. So I would probably argue that you need some Venn diagramming here, and you need to decide what type of science are we talking about. That is, what is the outcome that one is looking for here? There is a big difference between the non-linearity of discovery, which governments have difficulty dealing with because it may go beyond successive parliaments until you see the outcome. Whereas if you've got a more linear driven event with a directed outcome, then you could get your head around that better.
Thank you. Paul, and then Steve, and then Naomi.
So I would say that there is definitely something, in that comment. I think, and I think it refers to what going back to what David was saying there, I think part of the question is to what end is it you're seeking here? So if you're talking about, I certainly believe we can do better in trying to articulate what the UK is good at in R&D in different places across the UK, and with a view to getting more private sector investment in those places. And I think there's work for us to do there to really sort of shine a light on what we're good at. But that has to be based on evidence as well. And I think so. Another thing we're working on as well is making much more evidence, making the data more transparent to everybody, so people can see what places are good at, with regards to R&D. And I think that is important. So when we talk about trying to build R&D ecosystems, we have to try and build capacity, but you need a kind of you need a kernel of you need a hot coal there, as it were. There's no point just investing where there is nothing in R&D. I think you'll have real trouble building something up. So, but that has to be based on evidence. There is a risk that every place puts its hand up and said we are the best at medical research or whatever, and I think we have to base it on evidence when it comes to focusing on developing R&D ecosystems. So I think I'm in agreement, but it has to be on the basis of evidence, and we have to get beyond a sort of tabloid-esque view of the world as well, because actually within sectors there's all sorts of subsectors, subdisciplines, that actually places can be good at. So the system needs to allow people to develop. Yeah, so I'll stop.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. Steve.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Having been on many MRC and other funding panels, I have long been somewhat frustrated, to be honest, I guess, by a culture which spreads what is often quite not a lot of money around a lot of places, rather than focusing that investment in one or two centres of excellence. So I think a transition towards funding a smaller number of locations to create what could then be world-leading centres is a change that certainly I think we would like to see.
Great, and finally, Naomi.
I think we are talking about quite a lot of different things. So, and that's good. There's action needed across all of the areas that have been discussed. So whether we're talking about the kind of discovery as well as the more mission-oriented or specific focus, I think one of the challenges when we think about, everyone saying we are the best at, give us the funding. On reflection, I think a lot of that is derived from, we have this funding available for this specific thing. Tell us what you're good at, and it will tend towards what there is funding for. So I think there is a role there in designing our programs from a public perspective on how do we ensure that we can support diversity places actually genuinely building on their own strengths, articulating those and actually providing a way for those to develop. Because obviously for various reasons this call it has a big focus on life sciences, and in the UK that's where a lot of our funding is around and expertise is on balance, but actually there's breadth much more broadly across the spectrum of sectors and areas, and ensuring that the way the innovation strategy, for example, does missions and challenges, which will be one of the key things in this, actually enables support for places. I think one thing CBI is looking at is really this issue around economic clusters, as I mentioned, and really those are going to have to be focused around areas of innovation and strength, because that's where future growth is going to come from. And one of the things we're really keen to do is make sure there is that business-led demand in an area, particularly when we're thinking about growing the economic clusters with those spillover effects, and that will have to be done in partnership with various parts of the research base. And I think that local determination of what there is actually appetite as well as capability for will be a really important part of that. So I think there is a role for national strategic direction and also the sort of public funds available with that, but there's also a role for from a private sector lens, sort of business-led demand within a region, and CBI is looking at what we can do to help convene some of that so that it isn't just lots of disparate voices, and thinking about how can we help support that across different places in the country, but also thinking about different levels of government across the country as well, with different levers at a national and at a more local or regional level needing to be pushing in the same direction to see any tangible success on this. So it goes back to the point about join up. and it can't just be national imposed, but there is a role for national strategy.
Thank you. Excellent. So just before I go to Johnny Rich to ask his question, I've got two questions in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee, which obviously I don't know who those are, who that is. So unless they raise their hand under attendees, I'll read the questions out, but it'll give you a chance to potentially someone knows who they are. So we'll go to Johnny.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for fascinating contributions so far. I wanted to ask, to what extent should research spending be directed by government or politicians? I'm thinking, on the one hand, there are important democratic priorities that politicians and government are in a position to know and to direct, but on the other side, you want research that is free to follow where the impact is and where the questions are. I'm obviously thinking of ARIA in particular, and whether or not it needs to be outside of UCRI.
Okay, great. Who would comment on that? Naomi and then Paul.
I know that I want to say something, and I'll try and form my thoughts as I go. Hi, Johnny. Nice to hear from you. I think there's always going to be a role with public money. There's public responsibility for that. So there is a role for government and ministers in that. Those are slightly different things. There's ministers and there's government. There's a huge amount of strategic convening that's important in directing funding. I think within that, one of the things our members often note is the areas of some really valuable areas of support don't require quite so much strategic investment from government. For example, Innovate UK's SMART awards, the sort of open grants, those are always oversubscribed and underfunded. And there is, for example, in that space, the opportunity to have some public funding going towards the strategic goals of others other than government. Often they will or are aligned, but might not fit neatly within other funding categories. So I think it is really important to ensure that within the mix there is sufficient support for funding that isn't specifically directed by government. On the university side, there's block grants, there's various other elements that do some of that, and within the private sector, there's obviously own private funds, but also that risk sharing approach to some stuff that could potentially be really valuable, but isn't specifically within this particular government's closely controlled strategic. And I think making sure that you've got a good mix of those levers across the spectrum is really important. ARIA is an interesting one, high risk, high reward. There's a lot of question marks and a lot of things still to be filled out in terms of detail. I'm sure, Stephen, you'll be doing excellent work on the committee as you look to engage with that and make sure that it's really going to work. It is an experiment. Experiments, we all love them, but making sure that it's got the best chance of success. And I think ensuring that it builds on I guess, direction of travel and has enough freedoms but enough controls will be important. One of the big things from that we think that would be really useful for the rest of the system is actually it demonstrates an appetite and a recognition of the role of risk in innovation, in doing anything interesting. In creativity, you need a bit of headroom to do that, and not everything's going to be 100% success. If it is, you're probably not being creative enough. And I think actually one of the challenges is, to your point about should it be in or out of UKRI, there's a whole debate there. But one of the potential benefits could be recognizing the value and importance of risk and how you can perhaps build more of that into the rest of the system. So I think one of the struggles for a lot of funding within UKRI is actually really risk averse. I'd say that's not because the people within it really want it to be, but when funding is squeezed and when measures are very, very much looked at on a project by project success basis, actually it's very difficult to do anything creative. So looking at that perhaps with a more portfolio approach and outcomes approach to success measures, and thinking about it within increased budget lines, you can actually do some more interesting things. So hopefully some of that high risk, high reward stuff from ARIA might read across into other parts of the system as well.
Absolutely. That's, I think from what I've seen so far of ARIA, it's very much a very, very high acceptance of risk and failure, and that not judged on failure, it's judged on the quality of the work that's undertaken, but that sometimes can fail. Right, sorry. Paul.
Yes, I think Naomi has pretty much said what I was going to say. I think short answer is I think you need both. I think it's quite right that politicians of the day, you know, look to really back particular missions and technologies, and it's right that we should be making decisions and doing that. But you know, by our very nature, I think we don't have the information at our fingertips. Civil servants like me don't really know what the next big thing will be in terms of technologies. We're the wrong people to ask. You know, there is an absolute need for that discovery research and discovery science, which you know, which sets new things off in train that we can't possibly even predict at this point. So you very much need both. And with regards to ARIA in and out of UKRI, yes, I think ARIA, you know, the development of ARIA comes out of, I think, a slight probably worry that our system. A question is our system squeezing out the more experimental type of research that we might do. So it will be really interesting to see how ARIA does, but I think absolutely there is also an agenda for us to look at this in the broader system and to think about how research is assessed and valued and judged, and whether we can make sure that we're allowing space for that sort of thing in the broader system as well. So.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. Right, I think I've now got a hand up, which is Chris Rapley, Professor Chris Rapley. I'm assuming that was in my in response to the anonymous attendee. Chris, is that right? And do you have a question? And then following Chris, I'm going to go to Tom Nichols.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Can you just signal that you can hear me? I can see.
Well, I can see a picture of you and hear
oh, even that. Wow. Okay, it was just a comment really, and that is that we've heard a little bit about sort of discovery science and delivery science. I just wanted to make the point that it's just a little bit more complicated than that. If you think of science in terms of consideration for use or quest for fundamental understanding, then basic science scores high on the quest for fundamental understanding, but nothing on consideration for use. So that's a sort of Marie Curie style. If you look at Edison's style application of existing science to commercial purposes, then that's delivering stuff and it's applied. But there's a third type, which is often called use-inspired science, and it actually requires something different. This goes to Naomi's comment about silos. It requires the scientists to work with, who generate information, to actually work in a different way with people who use that information or might use it, may not even realize that they need to know that information. And it requires a whole new set of skills outside the normal training of scientists as researchers. And the problem with most academia is that there's a huge premium paid on discovery, despite all of the fine words about impact. But one's esteem, the reward system, the funding system tends to push people over towards the discovery side. And the skills and contacts and networks to actually work with people to deliver stuff that allow them, I don't know, to defend London against flooding or build hospitals that don't overheat, are rarely taught, tend to be built up on a case-by-case basis. So there's a whole area there in which we could do much better. And this isn't something confined to the UK. This is an issue for academia more generally, that is connecting with the real world. And what we found is that you need to understand the social sciences, you need to understand the psychology, the neuroscience of how those interactions take place, and essentially control them in a way that leads to positive outcomes along the shortest path. So I just wanted to, just point out that it's not a simple linear thing from basic research to delivery. It's more complicated than that.
Brilliant. Thank you for those comments. I don't know if anyone wanted to agree or disagree. If not necessary, we can just take the comments as read. So thank you for that, Chris. Right, we will now move on to Tom Nichols, and then it will be Narendra. Tom.
Good morning, Stephen. I hope you can
Morning,
hear me.
Tom.
Good morning, Tom. The presentations I've heard so far, that they focus, I feel, on the corporate environment, which is very good. They employ a lot of people. But I am concerned, of course, from the perspective of SMEs, particularly as they've been somewhat adversely affected by Brexit and clearly COVID. So in building back, how do we, and my concern with SMEs, I've noted in this country, is that they have a tendency to become, or start up and become niche small businesses employing very few people. What we really need is for small businesses to grow into corporations. How can we encourage the R&D sector, the science sector, to allow small businesses to grow significantly and become big employers? Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Who would like? Yes, Steve, and then Naomi.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And I think, I mean, a couple of things really. At a basic level, lab space would be good. There's currently a 2-year wait for lab space in Cambridge. So if companies want to expand, there's a physical constriction on that. So creating that infrastructure that allows companies to grow. I think the other, and maybe I disagree with you slightly, Tom, I think the issue here is in the investment community. And I don't know what the answer is, but the problem is we don't have an investment community that's willing to invest the tens to sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in Series B and Series C funding that will allow these companies to grow in the same way as they do in Boston, South San Francisco. That for me is the gap that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you. And yes, a good point. I think that's partly why one of the things we're really looking at, and what our Innovation Council has steered us to look at, is how can we work, get small and large companies working better together on innovation, because that is in lots of different sectors and increasingly a model of how innovation is happening, how R&D is happening. So that's one thing, and very much agree with that. There's the potential prizes, as we've looked at through our economic vision work at CBI. There's real prizes on offer for the UK in terms of thinking about innovation and SMEs. So you know, at a very basic level, which is more innovation adoption rather than R&D, but actually moving more SMEs to be sort of full tech adopters would make a massive impact on productivity, but also on the UK economy. But if you think that puts businesses in a much better position to then actually start being not just adopters, but doers of innovation. And if you look just broadly at the numbers, if we want to increase the amount of R&D happening in the UK and the amount invested in R&D in the UK, business investment is going to have to be a whack load of that, 2/3-ish. But we have a relatively small number of businesses doing R&D in the UK. So in order to grow that number, you will have to have some of the existing investors increase investment. You will have to get investment from businesses that already exist either in the UK or outside of it, investing in the UK, or get new businesses to start investing in R&D. And a lot of those might be SMEs, and they might then be growing. So that the scale up potential is enormous, and the value of R&D in terms of being a critical enabler and helping businesses to really have that competitive advantage and grow is enormous. And scale up's generated $1 trillion turnover for the UK economy, despite making up 1% of the SME population. So thinking about how I think talking about SMEs more broadly, that's an exceptionally broad category, which includes our shop down the road, as well as ambitious potential R&D investors. So I think there's a lot more granularity needed there in terms of when we're talking about SMEs, but those that would be in that sort of high growth potential category, I think you're right, there's real opportunity to provide increased support there. Finance, as Steve's mentioned, is a big part of that, but I think also a big one is being able to understand what the UK offer is. When we surveyed businesses in Italy in October. It was for large businesses as well, but they have a bit more resources at their hands to try and navigate things. But over 10% of SMEs that we asked about what would make the biggest difference to you being able to innovate more in the next 12 months, of a whole suite of options, including funding, finance, etc., 10% chose as the one thing they could choose was understanding and navigating the offer better. So as well as improving the offer, let's make sure that people can understand what's there, and SMEs in particular need help to do that. So that would be a big area.
Thank you very much. Right, we will move on to the next question, which is from Narendra Ramnani. I hope that's a correct pronunciation. Mirinda?
Yes, it is. Hi. So in January, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL published a report on the challenges for biomed innovation and vaccine delivery. And one of their key recommendations was that the conditionalities, and I'm quoting here, the conditionalities must be put into place to ensure global, equitable, and affordable access to any innovations that have benefited from public investment from the start of any future vaccine development program. So what steps do you feel businesses and government need to take to internationalize affordable vaccine delivery? Because after all, so the saying goes, none of us are protected unless we all are. And the other second question, which is slightly mischievous and directed to Steve and Naomi, is how convinced are you that the public receives a proportionate return on public investment in biomed?
Questions. Who shall we go to first?
Well, I'm happy to start, Stephen, and I'll start with number 2 and go to number 1. Now, I've worked in basic research in pharma my entire career, so you will not be surprised to hear that I am absolutely convinced that the public receives a proportionate return on public investment in the pharma business. And 2 comments. Yeah, any new medicine that's brought to patients has a patent life of round about 20 years. After that time, that's the time the company makes its profit, and a very significant proportion of that profit is reinvested in R&D. After those 20 years, that medicine is free to society for the rest of time. The company no longer makes any money on that medicine, it becomes generic. The other is, if you look at medicines, existing medicines of ours that we've launched for cancer over the last few years, these are medicines that are now giving patients anything up to 10 years of healthy life, whereas previously they would have died within 6 months or so. If you work out the full economic cost of that increase in life, that itself pays for the investment in that medicine many times over. So I'm convinced, but you'd expect me to be. In terms of question 1, now, I've not been involved in AstraZeneca's vaccine program, but I think the key question here is all around manufacturing capacity. If there were more plants that were able to manufacture vaccine, and there were more plants that were able to manufacture the raw materials that were required to deliver those vaccines, that would be happening today.
Yeah, I would agree with Steve on this one, actually, that, the investment here, it's about $1 billion from structure to prescription in the pipeline. And the risk is taken with the industrial sector here. They have a lot of failures as well as a lot of success. And, AstraZeneca are to be congratulated what they've done with the vaccine. They've run it out at cost, and you've seen all the stick that they've received, mainly from their competitors in the United States, because they're perceived to have undercut them. But yet they're trying to do something to help the planet. So, it's a bit ironic that they've got themselves into the position they've got themselves in terms of public relations, when they're actually doing a good thing for both this country and the wider community out there, notwithstanding all the problems that we're seeing with the European Union's behavior towards this company, which, to be frank about it, has been pretty disgraceful.
Thanks for that, David. Naomi? Do you want to add anything?
I don't have anything particular to add. I think, yeah, we'll leave it there.
Fine. So unless there's anything else to add, that's fine. Thank you for those. And then our very last question is from Minhaha Pham, who is the science counsellor at the French Embassy. Please go ahead with your question.
Oh, hello. Thank you for giving me the floor. Thank you for this very interesting roundtable. Somebody mentioned the fact that having pluridisciplinary approaches will be needed for more than ever for the future, especially to answer big challenges such as the pandemic or climate change issues. And I was wondering how you figure out the way to combine social science and humanities approaches together with STEM science, let's say, approaches. It's always a wish, but it's more difficult than just wishing to do so. So I would like to have your your suggestions on how to improve these interactions.
Brilliant, thank you. Naomi.
Thank you. I think I mentioned some of this very briefly. I think one of the questions is beyond just at that research phase. So if we take about the whole life cycle of something coming from research into being in public use, if we can put it that way, you know, thinking about the regulatory or the economic or the behavioral science that's attached to adoption of any particular technology or process or product, you know, when you think about climate change, actually how much of that's due to how the personal decisions that lots of us make. That's the realm of the social sciences and humanities, and I think there's real potential perhaps to combine you know, some of that expertise within, maybe even within the innovation kind of sphere, rather than just at that very early stages research, where so that there's potential to think about this in perhaps slightly new ways, where rather than just at a sort of research collaboration stage, but actually at those different phases, you know, think about regulatory expertise or ethics of AI, all of that is needed to be combined for a successful adoption and diffusion of whatever comes out of our innovation.
Brilliant, thank you. Any final comments? No, in which case, I can't see anyone indicating. Can I thank our panelists today on your behalf for a fantastic discussion around this really important issue of how we build back better following the pandemic and the role of science in that. And I think we've explored a wide range of options, opportunities, some risks, some areas where the government could improve. So thank you for your contributions. And of course, thank you to our questioners and to our audience as well for their participation. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion as much as I have. So on your behalf, can I thank David Patterson, Steve Reese, Naomi Weir, and Paul Drabwell. Thank you very much from me as well. And also can I thank Andrew Mackenzie and Tom Addison from the Physiological Society for helping to facilitate this discussion and put it together. Thank you both. And of course, as usual, I need to thank my team at the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee. Of course, there's Lee Jeffs, John Slater and Karen Smith, and Alfie Hoare, who I think will be writing up a report of this discussion for our quarterly magazine, Science in Parliament, which now goes to every member of both houses. So a good readership, and they'll be able to see the discussions that we had. So thank you for that. Our next meeting will be on the evening of Monday the 7th of June at 5:30 p.m, where the theme will be the Natural Capital Initiative, and that's being sponsored by the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. Until then, thank you all again for your attendance, and I hope to see you on the 7th of June. I will see you then. Thank you all very much indeed. Cheerio.